Hey, when someone else's negligence changes your life forever, figuring out what to do next can feel overwhelming. You need lawyers who won't back down. The NACE Law Group has been winning serious injury and wrongful death cases in D.C. for decades. They don't just settle, they fight for real justice, and they're not afraid to take cases to court to get it. You might remember them as Paulson and Nace. It's the same trusted lawyers, just a new name. If you need someone in your corner, reach out to NACE Law Group for a free, no-obligation consultation. Visit WashingtonDCInjuryLawyers.com or call 202-463-1999. That's 202-463-1999. Today on CityCast DC, on Friday, after a hearing over the latest twists in Donald Trump's efforts to take over Washington's police, the DC government was able to claim at least a small victory. But the details aren't quite so clear-cut. Yes, DC's police chief is still in charge, but it looks like the feds may still be able to order local cops to violate DC laws. There's another hearing this week. National Security Attorney Brad Moss is here to break down where the case stands and the current legal state of play with all those other federal forces on DC streets. Today is Monday, August 18th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Brad, thank you for being here.
Happy to be here. Happy to join.
So, can you break down this lawsuit for us in plain English? DC Attorney General Brian Schwab is suing the Trump administration. What does his suit say?
Sure. This is essentially a lawsuit brought by the DC government claiming that the Trump administration, by and through these delegated orders to the Attorney General, has exceeded the rather narrow statutory authorization afforded to it by the DC Home Rule Act. Putting that simpler, when the DC Home Rule Act was passed 50-something years ago, ensuring local control, there were various exceptions into the law that were introduced that gave the president and Congress the ability to step in certain circumstances. One of them, obviously, that's been invoked here has to do with law enforcement and coordination between federal and local authorities. And the president invoked what's known as Section 740, I believe, is the particular provision that allowed him to, quote unquote, introduce federal law enforcement into the city for a federal purpose and to utilize local authorities, local law enforcement as part of that effort. That's what was being challenged, was the extent to which he had gone beyond the scope of that particular provision.
So there was a hearing on Friday afternoon. Did the Trump administration respond to this before the hearing or during the hearing?
No, they didn't really have a chance. The federal judge, Judge Reyes, convened a hearing rather quickly within a matter of hours between the lawsuit being filed and a temporary restraining order being requested. It was a matter of hours before the hearing had been convened. So the Justice Department lawyer who was assigned to it was kind of just flying by the seat of their pants, trying to handle this, no doubt. What came out of that hearing, of course, was sort of a temporary solution for the moment. Didn't necessarily resolve the larger fights, but it certainly addressed the issue of who's in charge of DC police. The Trump administration was trying to put the DEA administrator in charge of DC police. The judge said that the statute doesn't give you that power. So there's a new order out from the Justice Department saying that DC police are still controlled by DC police leadership. They just are coordinating now with federal law enforcement, but they do not report to them.
So, right, the thing that triggered this lawsuit was this effort to claim that Trump's designee is actually acting as the police chief, which the city had said is not part of this exception in the Home Rule Act. The mayor and the city's attorney general came out, talked to the press afterwards. People treated it as a victory. I think as you say, a lot still to be decided, but there's also a lot in there that doesn't seem quite like it merits them claiming victory. Can you explain some of the other things that came out of this hearing besides the police chief retaining her position on the org chart?
Sure. It was certainly a temporary victory for the city. They certainly got their headline. There remains a lot to be seen, and there will be another hearing this week on the other aspects of the orders came out from Attorney General Bondi about the extent to which local law enforcement and federal law enforcement are cooperating, especially when it comes to situations where there is a conflict between federal law and local DC law. Judge Reyes indicated at the hearing this week she wants to discuss, probably through an evidentiary hearing, what the quote-unquote federal purpose is, the extent to which there is, in fact, a quote-unquote emergency that justifies these actions. She just didn't have enough information in front of her at Friday's hearing to delve into that on the merits. And the city's going to have a bit of a heavy load for it, despite what some of us might think in terms of the deficiencies in the president's arguments about a quote-unquote emergency. The DC Home Rule Act does give some broad deference to the president here, and there's going to be sort of an aspect of how far a judge can really wade into that, how much of it is really between political branches and is not appropriate for judicial review. So it's entirely possible that DC got this temporary victory on Friday, and that at the upcoming hearing or hearings this week and possibly in the upcoming weeks, they might ultimately fail. Time will tell on that. But for the most part, they got what they immediately wanted, which is local control remains under local control.
Remember that amazing little cafe you discovered last summer? With the perfect latte and the crazy view? Or that sweet hiking spot your friend told you about, but you can't quite remember the name? With Overlook Maps, special places never get lost again. Create personal lists of places that you've been and want to go. Build your must-visit list for your next vacation, your foodie favorites for date night, or your weekend getaways for when you just need to escape. Planning a trip with friends? Create a shared list where everyone can add their ideas. Visiting a new city? Check out lists from locals who know the real gems, not just the tourist traps. And here's the best part. No ads cluttering your lists. No one selling your data to advertisers. Just your personal collection of amazing places organized exactly how you want them. Overlook Maps. Collect, organize, and share the places that matter to you. Download free at overlookmaps.com. And check out overlookmaps.com/DC to see some of our lists and great spots on a map and in your pocket. Your places, your way.
All right, so there's a bunch of things to unpack here, but after the hearing, Bondi, the U.S. Attorney General, issued an order saying that notwithstanding the fact that D.C. has laws that say the police can't do certain things to enforce immigration, the police have to do those things that are against D.C. law to enforce immigration. And what the judge in this hearing had said indicates that might be within their rights under this emergency provision of the Home Rule Act. Is that basically the long and the short of it?
Correct. And that's where most likely, at least at the hearing this week, there'll be some manner of evidentiary process. There'll be possibly some testimony, some documentation produced to flesh out how this would work, to flesh out both from a factual standpoint, but also from a legal standpoint, the degree to which the federal government can sort of overrule DC's local state laws on these matters, whether it comes to immigration issues, whether it comes to dealing with the homeless, things along those lines. Because Judge Reyes did indicate some hesitation with the DC government's argument at the hearing on Friday regarding the idea that DC could just pass its own law that contravenes federal law on this and get around that provision in Section 740. The judge didn't rule one way or the other. Don't really know where it's going to go on the merits. That's why there'll be at least one more hearing. But that's going to be sort of the next step in this process. And it'll be interesting, depending on how this comes out, and recognizing that this is very much somewhat a DC specific issue because of the uniqueness of DC as opposed to every other city, state, town in the country, whether or not the government could use this to expand its immigration efforts countrywide. We know that there's a discussion about trying to do this in other urban areas. So the results of this litigation could have national implications.
In the hearing, can you explain, what are they arguing about? Are they arguing about the meaning of this 1973 law that established home rule? Or, as you said before, are they arguing about whether or not this is legitimately an emergency and how Trump, what his proof is that this is an emergency that merits his being able to have intervention.
So it's more the latter than the former. They're not no one's questioning, obviously, the legitimacy of the law. What they are having to do for, honestly, the first time is evaluate how to enforce it and how this emergency provision is reviewed by a court. Just because something is passed as a matter of law, it doesn't necessarily mean Congress always explains how on earth they expect courts to evaluate it, to balance the descriptions and the arguments of the federal government against that of the local authority here. And so judges have to flesh out what is judicially reviewable, what sort of deference do I give to one side or the other, what kind of standard do I apply when deciding whether or not, in this particular case, the federal government has met its burden.
Its burden to show it's an emergency?
To show it's an emergency, and or that even to the extent the judge has questions about the extent to which it's an emergency, that the judge doesn't have the authority to review that determination, that it's a strictly political decision, not a judicially reviewable one, which is certainly more along the lines of what the Justice Department is saying and is very consistent with what Donald Trump, Stephen Miller, and Pam Bondi have been saying for a lot of these cases, which is these are political questions. The judges shouldn't be making assessments. We've seen that in all the immigration cases where they're basically saying you're wading into areas that are beyond your expertise or authority.
Well, right. An emergency is one of those words that doesn't have a legal meaning. It's sort of the eye of the beholder.
Correct. And so that's sort of where the judge is stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. And that's where the hearing this week and probably additional pleadings will address is what is the standard? How do we, what did Congress mean in terms of how judges would apply or interpret this provision? Because no other judges had to do this. I mean, we went through the 80s and 90s in D.C. and this never got invoked. You would have thought it would have happened back then if it was ever going to happen, but it's being invoked now. And Judge Reyes is going to have to be the first one to really figure out how to apply it, knowing that whichever side loses will probably appeal it to the D.C. Circuit. And so knowing that her assessment, her analysis will be questioned.
This sort of push and pull between the city and the executive branch is about the police, but that's only a part of what's going on here. The other thing that's particularly made news over the weekend involves other parts of Trump's chain of command, and specifically these National Guard troops that are on the streets. He mobilized the D.C. National Guard, which under the rules of home rule, he gets to run as if he was the governor. But now we've heard that at least 3 red states are sending their National Guard troops to Washington, and that these troops who are currently not armed as they go around the streets are going to become armed or may become armed. What's the state of that, and what is the law on this? Can those soldiers arrest people if they see crimes happening?
So there's actually a case in California, I believe it's still ongoing, where Gavin Newsom brought a challenge. I think it's the California case. Don't quote me on that one for the moment, where there was this debate over the extent of the president's power to utilize the National Guard in this kind of context for local law enforcement. Because no, as a matter of federal law, the military cannot be engaged in domestic law enforcement. That's the Posse Comitatus Act. The problem, and this is Trump being Trump, is because no other president really tried this stuff outside of, you're thinking of the race riots in LA in 1992 with the Insurrection Act, which was very controversial and legally questionable at the time. No other president had tried it the way Donald Trump is trying it. And so there's not exactly a lot of case law on this subject. A lot of it was all customs and norms, and people had an understanding that you don't do this. So there isn't a lot of guidance for these judges as they figure out, how do we even evaluate these statutes? What kind of standards are we applying? Part of the debate in the California case was, if the president deploys the military in support of domestic law enforcement and has military conducting local arrests, what's the remedy? And the Justice Department said there is no civil remedy, and the only criminal remedy you can impose, because the president is immune under the recent Supreme Court ruling, which basically meant the Posse Comitatus Act is a nothing burger. That's sort of the unique struggle we're facing at the moment, because there isn't a ton of great precedent on this, because no one's done this before. So should the president be allowed to bring in these various other National Guard units to conduct local law enforcement in D.C. under the law? No. Is there some wiggle room for him? Absolutely. Is he going to push that to the furthest extent possible and hype everything up with polished videos on social media in the interim? Absolutely.
And then these other federal forces. Over the weekend, I was out a lot. I saw a lot of National Guard parked in photogenic locations. But, in neighborhoods, I would see Homeland Security investigations and DEA and so on. They are armed. They have police powers. I guess does that mean somebody has deputized them?
So the federal law enforcement officials are supposed to only be engaged in federal law enforcement actions, immigration matters, things like that. They are not supposed to be engaged in conducting arrests for strictly local domestic issues. We saw some of these videos come out over the last few days of local federal officials walking through back streets of parts of D.C. yelling at guys who had open containers of alcohol while sitting on their porch, saying you can't do that. Well, actually, under D.C. law, yeah, you can. No one made an arrest, so we don't know what would have happened if they tried. But those are the kinds of things where they're not really supposed to be doing that. That's not within their authority. That's still a D.C. police issue, but they're going to push the boundaries as much as they can until someone can stop them in court. And to the extent that your question is, can they do this? It's one of those things of they can and they will until someone finds a way to put a stop to it.
DC police under DC law have to have body cams. They have to have them on when they're involved in situations. I don't believe these federal agencies all wear body cams and have rules about that. If these feds are deputized for the district, do they fall under the rule that they would have to have body cams?
It's a really good question. It's one that a lot of people are throwing around, similar to local law enforcement is always subject to what's known as Section 1983 lawsuits, whereas federal law enforcement is not. Everybody's asking sort of if they're being deputized to do local law enforcement, are federal agents now subject to those lawsuits?
Wait, what are Section 1983 lawsuits?
Sorry, Section 1983 lawsuits, basically it's a civil rights claim that you can bring for monetary damages if your constitutional rights are violated by local law enforcement. It's set forth in federal law. It only applies to local law enforcement. It does not apply to federal law enforcement. Don't ask me why. So if these federal agents are being deputized, the question now that's coming out, and I'm sure somebody's going to try this in court, and I have no idea how it'll play out, is are these agents federal? Are they subject to that Section 1983? My assumption is no, they're not. But these are the unresolved questions that no one in the administration really seemed to have thought about nor cared about to figure out. They're just running with this. They figure they got shock and awe on their side. They're filming videos. I just saw stuff coming out yesterday. They're filming more hype videos of federal agents walking around Union Station, probably with some good hype music. This is the whole purpose. This is the Trump approach, is to make it look awesome, make it look amazing, and just hope people will not pay attention to details. And if it works, it's a scary proposition going forward for civil rights, not just in the DC area, because everybody hates us out here anyways, but it's going to be for the rest of the country, for urban areas across the country. And if once Donald Trump is out of office, it should be a concern for people in conservative communities having to worry about a Democratic president using this authority and putting it in small towns. This is not how law enforcement is supposed to be run, but this is Donald Trump's obsession.
So when it is federal forces or the National Guard, one of the phenomena of the last week has been people taping a lot of these interactions, but a lot of them also make people quite uncomfortable, particularly with these masked agents whose badges seem to be obscured. Are there any different rules in terms of what you, a citizen walking down a public street, can do in terms of watching or getting close to federal or National Guard compared to DC police?
For the most part, and I'll say that there probably are some people who are far better experts on this than I am, but as far as I understand the law, there is no distinction between those different types of law enforcement and military. That being said, no matter who it is you're videotaping in that regard, there are, of course, limits. You can't obstruct. You can't get in the way of them doing their actual functions. You can't advise whoever it is that they're detaining to conduct criminal action in response. You are entitled under the First Amendment to record them, to document them, to make sure that there is evidence of what actually did occur, which is a very vital part of holding anybody accountable, law enforcement, just like anybody else. And people who are doing that should continue to do that lawfully within their constitutional rights. But be aware that a lot of these individuals, and we're seeing this in the videos, are a little amped up, and be aware that they're going to push their ability to respond to you to the max under the guise of obstruction, claiming that anything you do they don't even remotely like, they're going to claim it as obstruction, and they will use force to push you back. So be wary, be cautious, be responsible when you make these recordings.
Are there laws about masking and or obscuring name tags or badges?
For federal law enforcement, unfortunately, as far as I understand, no, they're allowed to do that. Local law enforcement, you have to have name, badge, number, stuff like that. Those are basic things you're allowed to ask of your local law enforcement anytime. You have to be able to see the badge and the name. Federal law enforcement's different. The federal laws don't obligate in the same context, and these officials are exploiting that.
Even if they're here to supposedly enforce city laws.
Even if they're here allegedly enforcing city laws, that they're still bound only by the federal law. That is, of course, something that will be fought over, I'm sure, at some point in these various court cases. I'm sure some criminal defendant is going to bring that up in terms of these masked officials with their names covered up. I'm sure there's going to be the same thing for any of these people who are recording who have gotten arrested. They're going to bring it up. But the federal law at the moment doesn't really take into consideration doing local law enforcement aspects. So yes, at the moment, they're technically allowed to do this. It's a horrible optics look, but it fits right in with what the president and his social media influencers love.
So I got to ask, you work at one of the most prominent whistleblower firms in the country. Your partner, Mark Zaid, sued to have his security clearance restored after it was revoked as a sort of a punitive thing by the administration. Are you involved in any of this litigation about this particular alleged emergency?
No. So for the most part, it's being handled by arguably the one true body with authority to challenge it, which is the DC government. Local residents or local law enforcement wouldn't really have standing to bring a challenge necessarily. It had to be done by DC government, which has, its own internal legal department. That's who's supposed to do it. And I was glad to see them push back on this overreach.
So how do you see things escalating this week or in the longer term?
Sadly, I think we've already started to see it escalate. As you mentioned, the idea that some of these National Guardsmen are going to be armed. This is the concern. As it gets more and more heated and protesters are out there and they're going to agitate the enforcement officials, most of whom, no doubt, there's always going to be bad apples in these groups who say stupid things on camera, but most of whom are just trying to do their job. They didn't ask for this particular assignment. Some of them are going to get agitated. Someone's going to do the dumb thing and someone's going to get shot at some point, and it's going to be a problem because this was not inevitable. It did not have to reach this point, but it's so clearly and sadly going that route that the more and more you militarize this response and the more and more it comes with armed individuals, masked up, names obscured, it's almost inevitable that somewhere someone's going to do something stupid. And unfortunately, someone might get harmed or lose their life.
So what are the biggest things you're watching and our listeners should be watching this week?
How the introduction of these additional National Guards units gets handled, where they get deployed. So far, they're doing photo ops in safe, parts like Northwest DC. They're not going out into Southeast. They're not going where a lot of the major crime had been, where a lot of the concerns of residents had been. They're doing stuff for photo ops right now. But do they start fanning out? Do they start going out heavily armed with Humvees to patrol streets? And do they try to start doing local domestic law enforcement action? That's when the concerns have to be through the roof. At the moment, kind of just playing possum, and they're kind of just doing it for optics. If this gets worse and if this gets more heavy-handed, that's where it could get really bad.
Brad, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Hey, I got a favor to ask. CityCast is doing our annual listener survey. It would really, really, really help us if you took it. Please take the survey at citycast.fm/survey. It's only 7 minutes. We timed it. That's citycast.fm/survey. Plus, survey takers will also be eligible to win a $250 Visa gift card and some cool CityCast DC swag. Even if you took it last year, we would be grateful if you took it again since we can't use last year's data anymore. And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. This is a stressful time in DC. What questions do you have that you want us to dig into? Please send this episode to your friends, chat about it, and then email us your opinions at dc.citycast.fm. We might even feature you in a future episode. And become a CityCast DC neighbor. We need your support now more than ever. Thank you so much to our new members, Nusrat K, Marissa M, Laura K, Jamie M, and Tony G. Be like Jeffrey P, who became a member and wrote us to say, I have listened to this podcast for a while now, and it's an important resource for local news and information. As our quote-unquote local paper focuses more and more on national news, I felt it important to support a local news source to ensure that my city's issues are reported upon and investigated. Thank you, Jeffrey. Go to membership.citycast.fm, and we'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.